Now hear the word of the Lord from 2 Samuel 12, 1 through 10. So the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to tell David this story. There were 2 men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb he had bought. He raised that little lamb, and it grew up with his children. It ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day a guest arrived at the home of the rich man. But instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guest. David was furious. As surely as the Lord lives, he vowed, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. He must repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one he stole and for having no pity. Then Nathan said to David, "You are that man. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul. I gave you your master's house and his wives and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, I would have given you much, much more. Why then have you despised the word of the Lord and done this horrible deed? For you have murdered Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and stolen his wife. From this time on, your family will live by the sword because you have despised me by taking Uriah's wife to be your own." This is the word of the Lord.
You may be seated. Good morning, Sojourn. Peace be with you. It's good to see you guys. Good to be with you. My name's Jonah. I'm one of the pastors here at Sojourn. Our mission as a church is to reach people with the gospel of Jesus, build them up as his church, and send them to follow him in his world. And I'm really thankful that you're here to be a part of it. Got a tough story this morning, a tough situation. And I guess I just want to start by asking, have you ever noticed how rarely something good happens when you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing? And here's what I mean. Just try to fill in the blank of the sentence, or how does this sentence feel to you? I'll just make up a name. I don't know. Tyler. Tyler was supposed to be at school that day, or John was supposed to go to work that night, but. The story that we're looking at this morning begins with that kind of situation. Somebody not doing what they were supposed to be doing. And it's King David, which is difficult to stomach because the way he became king was because the king before him wasn't doing the things that a king was supposed to be doing. 2 Samuel 11 begins the context. It says, "In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem." That should set some alarm bells going off in our minds. He was scheduled to be on duty that day, but instead, this is what kings normally do. They go lead their armies in times of war in the springtime. This is what Saul was supposed to do. Remember when Saul, how big he was and strong he looked and how often he hid and didn't want to go fight? He wanted to put his armor on David so everyone would think he was out there fighting, but he was way too big for David. David's doing the same thing that the guy before him did. David doesn't seem bothered the least bit by this. He doesn't seem the least bit aware of him doing the same thing that he did as the guy before him, because look at what he's doing. Verse 2, it says, "Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He's so worried about shirking his kingly responsibilities that he's napping in the middle of the day. And worn out from his nap, what does he need to do after that? He needs to go for a walk along the roof." And for the sake of the story, because I'll just confess, I didn't really know this story for a long, long time. Real quick, crowd participation time. Who was on the roof here, David or the beautiful woman? David. Has anybody ever thought this beautiful woman was on a roof? Anybody ever thought that or had that? I thought that for a long time. The text doesn't say that, which is important for us as we go into this uncomfortable story. So, David isn't out at war. He's napping. David isn't out at war. He's going for slow afternoon walks when he should be out taking responsibility for his kingdom. He notices a lady taking a bath. It's very uncomfortable, and we'll see why even more so here shortly. He sends someone to find out who she is, finds out her name is Bathsheba, and her husband is one of David's soldiers, which means he's not home. So what does David do? Again, so while this man is fighting for David and the Israelite kingdom, David is napping, and then he's peeping on his wife. Verse 4, then David sent messengers to get her. If you look at this in other translations, it may say David sent soldiers or messengers to take her. And that's an important word. It's the same take that Eve does in Genesis 3 when she takes the fruit. It's the same take in Genesis 6 when the rebel Elohim come and take human wives. It's not a good word. And the grammar going on here is clear that David is the one doing the taking. The text holds David accountable for what's going on here, not these messengers, and certainly not this woman Bathsheba. Verse 4, when she came to the palace, he slept with her. She had just completed the purification rites after having her menstrual period. Then she returned home. Most of the time when I heard this story, this part was really left out. I always envisioned, here's how the story played out in my mind. Bathsheba went to the gym, and she got all sweaty and came home and went to clean herself up, and she knew she looked good because she was at the gym, and so she was on the roof just kind of flaunting her stuff or something like that. And then there was like poor helpless David. What was he supposed to do? This woman is not bathing to clean herself up. She's bathing in obedience to God in accordance with Leviticus 14. This is an act of personal devotion from Bathsheba. There is a 0% chance she's practicing this kind of piety on the roof for the neighborhood to look at. David is out on the roof and he's peeping into a window of a woman trying to obey God. There's just no room in the text to twist this to Bathsheba being some kind of seductress, anything less than a faithful woman of God. David, who should be at war being a good king, sees her, he wants her, and so he takes her. She finds out she's pregnant, and David immediately sends for Uriah. Why? Because David knows the child is his, and the fear creeps in. If you think people make bad decisions when they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, which you're right, they make even worse decisions when the fear creeps in. You ever watch someone in your life go totally sideways when they know they're about to be busted? When they know they're about to be exposed, when what they're hiding is about to be found out? The fear is creeping in here in David, and so he starts covering his tracks. He calls for her husband, thinking if I can get him home from war, he'll do what married couples do, and it can just be his baby and everything will be fine. But it turns out Uriah's a good man. He has something that David doesn't here, and that's integrity. That's honesty. Uriah comes home and he refuses to sleep with his wife. He sleeps at the entrance to the palace with the palace guards. Why? Listen to this man. Listen to what Uriah says. This is verse 11. The ark and the armies of Israel and Judah are living in tents. Joab and my master's men are camping in the fields. How could I go home to wine and dine and sleep with my wife? I swear that I would never do such a thing. How can I have all these comforts when my men are out in the field? When our soldiers are out there? When the ark of the Lord is out there? You see his religious fervor. He's saying, no way will I do that. So for whatever reason, the king has brought me home, but I'm going to sit and sleep outside on the ground with the rest of the guards. David really starts spinning now, man, because he's going to get busted. So he tells his general to put Uriah where the fighting is fiercest, and then, verse 15, pull back so that he will be killed. David takes this woman and sleeps with her, and then he executes her husband. He forces her to marry him. That's his last attempt to cover his tracks. Forces Bathsheba to marry him. But, verse 27, the Lord was displeased with what David had done. The more time you spend with the story of David and Bathsheba, the more it should make your skin crawl. It's a bad story. It's an abuse of power. It's an abuse of a woman. It's a murder and a cover-up. One of the things that really troubles me the most throughout all of it, especially given what we know of David, is that David couldn't see any of it. He just goes on, business as usual. He's blind to our own sin, his own sin. He doesn't see it. And I really hope none of us ever do the things that David did. I really hope that it can remain a Bible story. But I think all of us at some point will relate to that last thing I said, being blind to our own sin. You know, I've found that the hardest lies to uncover are the ones that come out of our own mouths. The ways that we deceive ourselves without even knowing it. Just think about, let's try to be nice to David for a second. I'll be mean to him in a minute, but do you think this was David's plan when he decided to stay home from war? Like, I think I'm just going to stay home and abuse a woman and murder her husband, and that's my plan for the spring. I don't think this was thought through. I think it was a series of him shirking responsibilities and sliding into self-deception. We know that David loves God. We know that David is a man after God's own heart. But even such a man was blind. And now, I'm not trying to be mean to anybody here. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say David loved God more than any of us do. I think he had greater faith than any of us do. And I know this for sure. God's plan for David's life was greater than God's plan for any of our lives. You are not going to be as big of a deal as King David. So, if a man with such significant purpose and such tremendous faith can be this blind, all I'm asking of us is to consider that we might be blind too. We might have things about ourselves, things we do, ways we protect ourselves that we don't see. And I want you to watch how God goes about showing David, because it's a sneak attack. God is smarter than you, and he's more clever than you, and he's more committed to your good than you are. So, and listen, if we knew where we were blind or how we were blind, we probably wouldn't be blind. If you know where your blind spot is in your car, you adjust your mirror so that the blind spot goes away. God comes around our defenses because we are blind. If David was willing to murder to cover up his sin, I don't think his buddy saying like, hey man, you shouldn't have done that was going to work. If he hides from his whole army, hopefully I don't need to belabor that point. I doubt it would have worked to just say, hey David, have you thought about repenting? God had to come at him from another way. So he sends a prophet to him to sneak around David's self-protective defenses. And that's the story that we began with this morning. There were two men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb he had bought. David's the rich man, Uriah is the poor man, and Bathsheba is a lamb. And so just one more quick word in defense of Bathsheba and the bad rap she's gotten in churches like ours the last 100 years or so. Can you think of anywhere else in the Bible where a lamb is used to describe someone who is guilty of sin? God had plenty of images he could have fed to Nathan if he wanted to say, and hey, Bathsheba had a part to play in this too, you guys. He could have said, this poor man just had one limping chicken, or he only had one goat that produced no milk, but he says a lamb, the same thing the scriptures use over and over to describe someone who is innocent and blameless. Bathsheba was not a seductress. Bathsheba did nothing wrong. She was an innocent victim. And all of us are hearing Nathan tell this story, being like, oh, David, this is totally about you. And David has no idea that it's about him. You can hear his self-righteousness building up. This is something that people will do when they get defensive and self-protective. They'll throw Bible language on it, or they'll sound very holy and faithful. It's obvious to us, but that's the point. When it's your sin that's being exposed, it may not be obvious to you. There are no lies harder to see than the ones that come out of our own mouths. So Nathan finishes the story, and just listen to the self-righteousness of David. David was furious. As surely as the Lord lives, he vowed, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. And he probably felt good. King saying this in the throne room in front of the people, passing down his righteous judgment, the anointed one of Israel. David can see the obvious sin in the story. God has appealed to his imagination. He's snuck around his defenses. He's drawn out his self-righteousness, and in doing so has inescapably trapped David in his own sin. Then Nathan said to David, "You are that man. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul. Listen to the heartache. I gave you your master's house and his wives in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. If that had not been enough, I would have given you much, much more." There's hope here in some ways. The fact that God is still pursuing and appealing to David. He's still relentless in his affection and his commitment to David. You can hear the heart of a father breaking when he said, I gave you all this, and if you had asked for it, I would have given you even more. If this hadn't been enough for you, I would have given you even more. He reminds David of all he did for him, all he would have done for him. He reminds him of his love, how he saved him, how he provided for him. God is relentless in his pursuit of us. God is more committed to your good than you are committed to your good. God wants good things for your life more than you want good things for your life. And so here, God sends David a messenger to open up his eyes to what he has done, to open up his eyes to God's love and provision. Some of you are here this morning and you just need to be reminded that you haven't gone too far. You haven't done too much for the love of God. It will continue pursuing. He will continue wooing you. If you think you've done too much and gone too far, maybe you just need someone standing behind a pulpit in front of a Bible saying to you, that's not true. You haven't gone too far and you haven't done too much. Maybe you're here even this morning as a result of that pursuit. Maybe this morning is God's wake-up call to you to open your eyes and hear what he's telling you. So for some of us, be encouraged and be reminded that God never stops running after you. Even you who have blown it, even you who have messed up, God is relentless. That being said, we can't smooth out the edges of this story too much because all of us need to receive the warning of this passage. The consequences of our blindness are so severe. The consequences of our sins left unattended to are so severe. Beginning in verse 10, Nathan says to David, "From this time on, your family will live by the sword. Because of what you have done, I will cause your own household to rebel against you. You've shown utter contempt for the word of the Lord by doing this. Your child will die." I want you to know, yes, God's pursuit of you will never stop. His relentless love for you will never cease. And on the flip side of that, I want you to know there's no such thing as your personal sin. We're going to talk about some of this next week, but some of us fall into this trap thinking that the only person that our sin affects is us. I'm the only one it hurts. I'm the only one that affects. There's just no such thing as a sin that only wounds the person committing the sin. Do you see how many innocent victims are involved here because of David's blindness and David's sin? Let's just go through the list. What was Bathsheba doing? Obeying the Lord. And what happened? Soldiers took her so a king could do what he wanted with her. What was Uriah doing? He was trying to obey his king and honor his men. And what happened to him? A king trying to cover his tracks murdered him. What about the baby? This baby that dies because of the sin of his father who did nothing but be born. You had 3 people that are utterly innocent and horrific victims. And yet all three felt the consequences of David's sin. Some of us have been victims of another sin. For some, the story is a bit too familiar. And for those who it is, I want you to know that God sees you. He sees you out of love and out of concern and out of heartbreak. And I want you to know that no one gets away with it. Not even a king. No one gets away with it. The consequences of David's sin are severe and devastating. God does not turn a blind eye, even when perpetrators of sin do. Sin will deceive us. It will distort us. It will blind us. And so often, it's the innocent victims around us who will pay the price. In some ways, we need to begin taking sin far more seriously than we do. In processing his grief and his heartache, David wrote a song about this encounter. Psalm 51 is about this. It's about his sin with Bathsheba, the death of his child. It shows us a desperate man filled with grief and heartache. If you keep reading in 2 Samuel, David weeps, he fasts, he prays in sackcloth for his child. For nights on end he doesn't sleep and instead cries out to the Lord. When you read Psalm 51, when we talk about it now, don't think of David on his royal throne with his gold lyre singing these sweet songs of praise to Jesus or something. Picture a man desperate for the life of his child, wearing a potato sack, face down on the dirt, not sleeping, not eating. That's the image you need in your mind as you hear this. So with his face to the ground, David cries out in Psalm 51, "Have mercy on me, O God, because of your unfailing love. Because of your great compassion, blot out the stain of my sins. Wash me clean from my guilt. Purify me from my sin. For I recognize my rebellion. It haunts me day and night. Give me back my joy again. You have broken me. Now let me rejoice. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit within me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and make me willing to obey you." It's heart-wrenching and desperate. It's a man out of options, kind of crying out to God at the last minute. We're in a church, not a synagogue, though, meaning we're on the other side of the resurrection of Jesus. On the other side of the resurrection of Jesus, some of what David cries out for makes way more sense to us now. Try to think about this backwards. Sometimes reading the Old Testament, if it's confusing, reading it backwards can help you understand what's happening here. David ends this section here. He says, "Make me willing to obey you." Make me willing to obey you. What an honest prayer. If you have to ask God to make you willing to obey you, what does that mean about where you're at that moment? You don't have to ask for help wanting to obey God if you want to obey God. Does that make sense? This reminds me of, I don't know if y'all ever prayed this in college. God, if you get me out of this, I'll never drink again. You know, that kind of, David is saying, help me to want to not do this again, God. You see that? It's so honest. It's pretty raw. Make me want to obey you. What would he have done had he been willing to obey God? Probably would have been out with his troops, not at home taking naps and walks on the roof. He wouldn't have peered into a woman's bathroom while she was bathing. He wouldn't have taken her. He wouldn't have slept with her. He wouldn't have killed her husband. He wouldn't have covered it up. And he wouldn't have buried his child. Make me willing to obey you is perhaps the starting place of having our blindness healed, our sight restored. But how can we be willing? Is this just something we drum up within ourselves? That's not what David thought. I really believe this, because if you back up one verse, before saying, make me willing to obey you, he asks God to give him a clean heart. a new heart. He doesn't need willpower, he needs renewal, a new heart, a new spirit. When you look at the sin in your life, when you look at your own blindness, do you think of it in those terms? Not just that you need to try harder and you need to double down on your effort, but that what's needed is renovation of heart, a renewal. Right before that, David says, I recognize my rebellion. Do you? Do you see the things in your life and recognize them as rebellion? Now, if we're blind, you probably don't. I probably don't. What did David need? He needed someone to come and help him see. He needed a friend to confront him. Is there anyone in your life who can do that? Is there anyone in your life who knows you well enough, who you trust, who has access to, that can say to you, I know you don't see this, but I am begging you to see this. And I will just tell you, with all the Bible studies and all the memory verses and all of the podcasts and all the things that we spend our energy on, churches have given me money to be a Christian for almost 20 years now. And if I could boil it down, if I could say if there were two things that I wish I could change, or just wave a wand and make all of our churches this way. The first one, that we would have more faithful Christians who loved the people in their life enough that they could say true things to them. It may be difficult, may be painful, but say the things that they think the other person needs to say that maybe they don't see. So I would say first, make us a people, Lord, that are willing to say true things because of how much we love one another. And second, we're better at number one. We do that to a degree at number one. Number two, we're absolutely miserable at. I would say, Lord, make us a people who listen when our friends talk to us. Who make us listen when people talk to us. When people tell us something, that our first blush isn't to be defensive or dismissive or push it away, but to say, what would this mean if this were true? Maybe they're right about me. See, if you know that you don't want to obey God and that what you need isn't willpower or a new willpower, you need a new heart. And if you know that you have rebelled against God, that gives you a healthy dose of self-suspicion. A healthy dose of self-skepticism. Maybe I don't see myself all that clearly. Maybe I am a little bit blind. Who in your life after that can help you process whether or not a hard, true thing someone said is in fact true? If you don't have any of that, if you don't have someone that says hard things to you, and you don't have a place where you can go and process the hard things that are said to you, just whatever you're doing in your Christianity, make that priority number one. Find that. Cultivate that. Willingness. Make me willing. Help me to see. Help me. Give me a new heart. If you keep moving back in this psalm, he says, wash me clean from my guilt. Because of your great compassion, have mercy on me. Because of your unfailing love. So let me summarize this here for a second. Have mercy on me because of your unfailing love. Forgive me of my sin. Grant me a clean heart that I might want to obey you. Does any of that sound familiar? In Ezekiel, the promise of Messiah is this. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I'll wash you whiter than snow. I will take your heart of stone and remove it. I will give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you, and I will cause you to obey me. Psalm 51 is David crying out for Jesus, the anointed one, the true king of Israel, who would sit on the throne of David forever. He's crying out for the hope of the gospel, one who would come and show compassion, who would open the eyes of the blind, who would live for us, who would die for us, who would be raised for us, so that in him the promise of Messiah, the promise of Jesus could be fulfilled. We don't need to drum up new willpower or new courage or new insights. We have to receive the gift of a new heart and a new spirit that makes us willing to obey him. The only way you will live this kind of life, you will live with a willing spirit, you will live to ever receive the difficult words of a friend, the only way your eyes will be opened is if you see that Christ has set you free. The only way you can lay down your defenses is if you believe you have nothing left to defend. When someone comes with a difficult thing to say to you, you can say, well, if that's true, I'm forgiven and loved by Jesus. Anybody ever struggle to feel that, to believe that? I do. That you really are forgiven, that you really are cleansed. I know it seems a little upside down, kind of like the first shall be last, or if anyone wants to save their life, they must lose it. One of the ways to really experience and get in your bones the fact that you are forgiven is to own your sin when someone confronts you. To say, I did that. I accept that. And not this nonsense our culture does now. That isn't me. It actually is you. It actually is. My words do not reflect who I am and my values. Well, maybe they do. And if you are loved by God and you are secured by the blood of Christ, you can say, oh, my sin is ever before me. It haunts me day and night. I see my rebellion. That is who I am. That is what I've done. But by the grace of God, I won't be that way forever. You're right. Thank you for showing this to me. The payment of your guilt has been made through the blood of Christ. The pain of your shame has been healed with the unfailing love of Christ, who loves you because he loves you, because he finds you lovely and delightful and wonderful, and he desires you. He loves you not because of your repentance or your promises. He loves you because he delights in you. And the fear that drives you into hiding, the fear that drives you into self-protection and just continual awful decision-making, that fear has been quieted through the presence of Christ, the new Spirit that lives within you. And so communion that we celebrate every week is the promise that a new heart, a willing spirit is available if we receive it, if we want it. And so be reminded again of the promise. And I just try to pay a little bit of attention to the imagery. We do this every week, but it's so wonderful. The depth is incredible. On the night he was betrayed, Jesus took a loaf of bread. You notice the taking language again. It shows up all of the time in the scriptures, and then we get to the night Jesus was betrayed. Instead of taking a fruit that he shouldn't, instead of taking a wife he shouldn't, or a woman that he shouldn't, he takes his own body. He thanks God for it. He breaks it, and he says to his disciples, now you take this, eat this, and remember what I've done for you. What requirements did he put on them? He said, this is mine to give freely, and freely I give it to you. So take it and eat it. In the same way, when the meal was over, he took a cup of wine and he said, this is the cup of the new covenant, sealed with the shedding of my blood. And just please notice, he doesn't say your relationship with God is sealed with your promises of obedience, or how well you have life figured out or planned, or your spiritual activities, or how well things go for you, whether or not someone has sinned against you or not. He says your relationship with God, your eternal place in the kingdom of God is sealed because Christ's blood has been shed for you. Drink this and remember what he's done for you.